I got a special request to do a video about the Corla fight in Blackrock Caverns. Corla is an interesting fight because it's all about positioning and keeping track of your own debuffs. It looks kind of complicated at first, but it really isn't. Now, you start off with Skull is the boss. That's Corla, Herald of Twilight. There are three other mobs here that are all kneeling before her, and they are called Zealots, or Twilight Zealots. Now, you've fought a few of these on the way to Corla. They are evolved Twilight Zealots, which are big, monstrous things that do a ton of damage, especially with their big attack that you can interrupt. Now, these guys are waiting to be made into those evolved Twilight Zealots, and the way by which this happens is that there is a dead dragon hanging from the ceiling about halfway down the hallway. As you're facing the boss, chances are the dragon is going to be above you and behind you. Occasionally, Corla will call out these beams to come out from the dragon to hit these zealots as you're watching, prior to the fight. Once the fight begins, the beams become permanent. They're no longer little spurts, and those beams channel into each of the three Twilight Zealots around her. Now, when you start the fight, these Zealots do not engage you. They are waiting to be evolved. And once they get enough channeled energy from that dead dragon, they do become evolved and become active in the fight. The goal of this fight is to never, ever, ever let a Twilight Zealot evolve. The reason for this is pretty simple. They hit like a truck. They have this Shadow Strike ability that, while it can be interrupted, is very hard to interrupt unless you are actually directly targeting that mob. Now, the tank is going to want to be directly targeting Corla herself because he has to interrupt a fear called Dark Command, and it's very difficult to interrupt the fear and the Shadow Strike from any evolved zealot at the same time. So, needless to say, it is very, very important that no one messes up on preventing these zealots from evolving. That is the entire fight. Is basically there are three people that are going to be responsible for blocking that beam that is causing those zealots to become evolved. Now, what that beam does is it puts on a stacking debuff. That stacking debuff, once it hits 100, will evolve whoever gets the stacks, be it your party member or yourself or the Twilight Zealot. The debuff has a timer on it where it drops off in about the same amount of time it takes to stack up to 75 to 80 stacks. What this means is that you want to engage the boss and have three people block all three beams, one on each beam. And they stand in that beam and take on debuffs, stacks of that debuff, until they reach 75 to 80. And then each of them is responsible for their own timer on the debuffs. Each of them moves out of the beam, allowing the zealot to take on stacks. By the time your stacks drop off, the zealot will have around 70 to 80. Once your stacks drop off, you don't even have to look at the zealot himself to know how many he has. All you have to care about is when your stacks drop off, get back in the beam to start taking stacks again, and you will notice, if you actually care to look, that the zealot that was taking the stacks is no longer taking them and is at around 75 to 80. If the zealot gets to 100, there's a problem. But you have a buffer there, where you can get back in the beam when the zealot has 99 stacks if you take on that beam, and it's fine. There's no extra problem with that, you're just cutting it really close. As soon as anyone who's taking stacks gets to 100, then that person becomes evolved. And it's kind of like a mind control if it happens to one of the players. You actually become an evolved zealot and start attacking the people around you. And the tank will taunt off of you, and you're just sitting there helpless. There's nothing you can do at this point. So, The common strat basically is this: everyone starts down the hall facing the boss, and let's say you have a pally tank and a priest healer, a hunter, and a warlock, and a melee death knight, like an unholy death knight, whatever. Now, the color coordination should be familiar to you. The pink is the tank pally, the red is the death knight, the green is the hunter, the white is the shadow priest, and or the healing priest, and yeah. Anyway, you're going to want to have basically the melee in the middle, and the tank is going to want to put the boss on the same spot as that middle zealot, and turn the boss's back to the melee. So the tank is not taking any beams. Basically, you have the dragon shooting the beam through the death knight, the melee DPS. So he's blocking it from the zealot, who is standing on top of the boss, and he's still standing behind the boss for maximum DPS. And the tank is not anywhere near blocking that beam, so the tank doesn't have to worry about any of his stacks. This way the tank can concentrate completely on interrupting the Dark Command, which can be problematic in a fight like this, where, like, oh shoot, I only have 20 stacks, and I got feared out of the beam. Now the zealot is taking on stacks, but my stacks are not dropped off. By the time my stacks drop off, the zealot will have evolved, or the zealot has not had his stacks drop off yet, and he starts taking on stacks again, refreshing the timer on his stacks. So for the tank, it's absolutely imperative that those dark commands are interrupted. Most of the time, the tank can do that himself, especially like a tank that has multiple interrupts. A pally tank can hold his Avenger's Shield in reserve in case, for some odd reason he needs to, because he has Rebuke. Now, so the pally tank, or the tank, is totally in charge of getting the interrupts. It's nice if a melee DPS can do it as well, like if a rogue wants to kick or something, but you really, as a melee DPS, would want to just keep watching your stacks, do your rotation, and then basically you just slide out of the beam, off to the side, attack from the side instead of the back, and let the zealot take stacks until yours drop off. Same thing goes for the outsides. Usually you want to put ranged on the outsides because they are too far apart for a melee to take it and still be able to DPS. So like a hunter can disengage out of the beam and do it really nice and quick. Otherwise any ranged DPS will do, where they can just step out of the beam. Now, one caveat here, one thing to really pay attention to is these beams are sticky. WoW tries to be nice and forgiving when it comes to getting in the beams. So, like, if you're close to where that beam may be hitting, it's going to lock on to you. But getting out of them means not just, you don't just move like one step to the right or to the left to get out of the beam. No, you have to move like 10 steps or so. That's why I like on my hunter, I disengage out of it. Now, the healer, this is a really easy fight to heal. The healer can, if needed, take a beam as a reserve person to block a beam just in case someone gets feared or whatever. And that's kind of like the backup plan. The healer is watching for beams that are not being tended to properly and will block that beam if one of the people gets feared out of it. But ideally that's not going to happen. It's just a nice thing to have in reserve. So basically, let's start the fight here. We have the tank running in, aggroing the boss to pull the boss to the middle zealot, running through the boss and turning around, so the boss is now facing south, or facing down towards the bottom of the screen here. So the boss's back is to the dragon that's firing the beams. Ideally, a good tank will position the boss right on top of that zealot so that the melee DPS can be behind the boss and blocking a beam at the same time. The other two DPS in that same time have moved to block beams on the flanking zealots, and the healer is just kind of hanging back, watching things and making sure everything's kosher. Now, I'm going to basically, for the animation purposes of the video, coordinate when stacks happen. All three people that are blocking beams get 80 stacks at the same time. This is not necessarily going to happen in reality. Someone could start blocking beams earlier than others, so they have to get out earlier than others. It's all a matter of the individual DPS on each individual zealot to watch their individual debuffs, and when they get to 75 or 80, you get out of the beams. And then when your debuff drops off, you get back into the beams. They are going to desynchronize after a while. That's essentially the entire fight. So basically what you have is run in, block beams, get to 80 stacks, get out of beams. Keep DPSing. The stacks drop off of you. By that time, the zealot has 75 to 80, so you want to get back in so they don't get to 100. You start building them up to 75 or 80 again. By the time they get to 75 or 80, the zealot stacks have dropped off. You get out again. It's basically in the beams, out the beams, in the beams, out the beams. Every 75 to 80 stacks for each individual. So you don't even have to look at the zealots. You know that by the time your stacks have dropped off, the zealot has 75 to 80, and you need to get back in. So when your stacks drop off, just get back in and start taking stacks again. You don't even have to be concerned about what the zealot has. So you don't even have to focus your zealot, use them as a focus target. You can just keep focusing on the boss, and when your stacks get to 80, get the frick out. When your stacks drop off, get back in. This is not a DPS race. There is no enrage timer. Who cares about the meters? Who cares about who tops the charts? The entirety of this fight is managing the beams, managing the stacks. I've seen far too many wipes happen when a DPS gets so concerned about doing their DPS rotation to really top the meters that they ignore their stacks or forget about them for a split second. And then they get evolved. And then the zealot that they're on becomes evolved after they get, each of them gets to 100 stacks. And the tank now has two zealots to deal with, both of them casting the Shadow Strike every once in a while. That does about probably 100,000 damage, and I don't think it can be mitigated. Yeah, Corla hits like a wuss. Corla does not hit very hard at all. It is not very healing intensive. The tank just stands there interrupting dark commands while maintaining threat. And so it's entirely on those three people blocking beams. Now you can, if you have an absolute newbie that has no idea what they're doing, as a DPS, you can take the healer instead and use the healer as one of the ranged. For example, let's say you have a rogue and a DPS warrior instead of one of the ranged. So now you have two melee. That really sucks. Oh, now a healer has to take one of the beams. No problem. The DPS can even trade off taking beams, so the middle zealot never takes any beams or any stacks of the beams at all. So you still have your hunter on the left, you have your healer on the right taking beams, and like I said, Corla doesn't hit very hard, so a healer that can't watch their stacks and take beams and heal at the same time and such is pretty fail. And then you have both melee in the middle. What really, really, really sucks is when you have three melee, and at that point you're going to have to split one of the melee off to the side and just stand there managing a beam. It's really that simple. You can't do anything else. You're going to have a healer on one of the ranged beams, one of the melee on the other, just standing there taking beams, and you can't really tank the boss between two zealots so that the melee can manage beams and DPS at the same time. There are going to be range issues there. It's better to just let a melee sit it out and let the other two melee DPS hammer on the boss. So basically, that's it.